In autumn of 1995, Samuel Jones, a gifted black photographer from Charlotte, and his 12-year-old son, Elijah, drove their Ford Bronco into the remote, mist-shrouded mountains of Appalachia. Samuel was chasing the fiery colors of the changing season for a book project. Eli, his eager apprentice, was chasing his father's shadow with a small film camera of his own. They promised Samuel's wife, Sarah, they'd be back by Sunday night, their car filled with rolls of film and their minds with the quiet beauty of the highlands. They were never seen again. Their truck was found 2 days later, parked neatly at a disused trailhead in a forgotten corner of Western Virginia, keys still in the ignition. A massive search and rescue operation combed the unforgiving terrain for weeks, but the mountains yielded nothing. No tracks, no campfire remnants, no scraps of clothing. Just an unnerving, impenetrable silence. The official investigation concluded they had gotten lost, victims of the vast, indifferent wilderness. For 10 years, Sarah Jones refused to believe it. She searched for answers, her grief a cold, hard stone in her chest, convinced that people don't just vanish. Then, in the sweltering summer of 2005, a pair of amateur spelunkers exploring a fissure opened by a recent rock slide made a horrifying discovery. Squeezing through a narrow passage, they found a small, man-made chamber, the entrance sealed from the outside with mortar and rock. Inside, illuminated by their headlamps, were 2 skeletons, a rusted, high-end camera, and a child's water-damage field guide. The decade-long mystery of what happened to the Jones family was over. The hunt for their killers was just beginning. Before I begin, thank you for watching Minority Struggles. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really. A call came at 11:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, 10 years and 8 months after Samuel and Eli disappeared. Sarah Jones was in the climate-controlled stillness of the Forsyth County Records Archive, a place that smelled of aging paper and preservation chemicals. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of these shelves, to the rustle of brittle documents and the quiet hum of the microfilm reader. For the last 7 years, this had been her life, a self-imposed exile into the past. She wasn't just an archivist. She was a hunter, sifting through the dead-end trails of history, looking for a ghost. Her ghost. 2 of them. Her phone buzzed against the metal of her desk, a jarring intrusion of the present. Unknown number, Virginia, area code. Her breath caught, a familiar, painful reflex she'd never managed to suppress. This is Sarah Jones. Ma'am, my name is Detective Miller with the Virginia State Police. Are you the wife of Samuel Jones, who went missing in October of 1995? The voice was young, professional, devoid of the weary, almost bored tone she remembered from the local sheriff a decade ago. I am, she said, her voice a dry whisper. Her hand tightened on the receiver, knuckles white. She stood up, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Ma'am, we believe we've located remains that may be your husband and your son, Elijah. The words didn't land like a blow. There was no shock, no sudden, cinematic collapse. After 3,900 days of waiting, the news arrived quietly, a key finally turning in a rusted lock. The cold stone of grief in her chest didn't shatter. It simply grew heavier, denser, pulling all the air from her lungs. She had known, of course. From the very beginning, she'd felt it in her bones. They hadn't gotten lost. They had been taken, buried, hidden. Where? She managed to ask. In a cave on the east face of Black Ridge Mountain, near Havenwood Gap. It appears the entrance was deliberately sealed. Deliberately sealed. The phrase confirmed everything she had spent a decade trying to prove to anyone who would listen. This wasn't an accident. This was a burial. A murder. I'll be there in 6 hours, she said, and hung up the phone. The drive east on I-40, then north into the winding, two-lane highways of Appalachia, was a journey back in time. The landscape shifted from the rolling hills of the Piedmont to the imposing, ancient slopes of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The trees grew thicker, the valleys deeper, the sky smaller. It was a beautiful, menacing place, a land that kept its secrets locked in shadow and stone. She remembered the last time she'd made this drive, a week after they vanished, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, hope warring with a primal dread. She had met with Sheriff Cobb then, a man with a tobacco-stained mustache and eyes that seemed to have already decided the case was closed. He'd patted her hand and told her, "The mountain takes who it wants, ma'am." He'd made it sound like an act of God, not an act of man. She arrived in Havenwood Gap as dusk was settling, bleeding purple and orange across the ridgeline. The town was a small, forgotten clutch of buildings nestled in a valley, looking just as tired and weary as it had 10 years ago. The state police had set up a temporary command post in the volunteer fire department building. Detective Miller was waiting for her. He was young, maybe 30, with a sharp suit and tired, respectful eyes. He led her to a small, private office. "Mrs. Jones, I'm deeply sorry for what you've been through," he began, his sincerity a stark contrast to the folksy platitudes of his predecessor. "The medical examiner has made a preliminary identification based on dental records we had on file. It's them." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on a cardboard box on the table between them. "Personal effects," Miller said gently, "found with them in the cave." Her hands trembled as she reached for the box. Inside, nestled in evidence bags, were the artifacts of her stolen life. Samuel's Nikon F4 camera, its metal body rusted and caked with mud, the lens shattered. It was his favorite, the one he said felt like an extension of his own eye. Beneath it was a small, worn-out field guide, its cover warped and stained. A birder's guide to eastern North America. She had given it to Eli for his 12th birthday, just a month before the trip. The camera's film was too degraded to recover any images, "I'm afraid," Miller said softly. "The lab tried everything." Sarah barely heard him. She lifted the small book from its bag. The pages were stiff, fused together by a decade of damp and darkness. She worked them apart carefully, her archivist's hands moving with practiced delicacy. The pages were filled with Eli's neat, meticulous handwriting, notes on sparrows and finches, sketches of wings and beaks. He had been so proud of this book, so proud of the knowledge he was gathering. He was going to be just like his father, an observer, a documentarian of the world's quiet wonders. She reached the back of the book, the final few pages, and there, on the inside back cover, she found it. A faint pencil sketch, drawn with a frantic, pressing haste that was so unlike Eli's careful drawings. It wasn't a bird. It was a symbol, a crude, three-pronged shape, like a twisted tree root or a claw mark. It was jagged, angry, a child's drawing of something that had scared him. She stared at it, the simple lines burning themselves into her memory. What had he seen? Later that night, in a sterile room at the town's only motel, Sarah sat with the box, the field guide open to that final, cryptic page. A knock came at her door, sharp and authoritative. She opened it to find a man she recognized instantly, though 10 years had stooped his shoulders and deepened the lines on his face. It was retired Sheriff Cobb. He wasn't wearing a uniform anymore, just a flannel shirt and jeans, but he still carried the same air of ingrained, unquestioned authority. "Mrs. Jones," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you were in town. Just wanted to come by and say I'm sorry for your loss. It's a terrible thing, but maybe now you can finally have some closure." "They were murdered, Sheriff," Sarah said, her voice flat and cold. The cave was sealed. Cobb's eyes, small and dark, didn't flinch. He chewed on something, his jaw working slowly. "The mountain's a strange place. Rockslides happen. Caves seal themselves up all the time." Tragic, he looked past her, into the room, his gaze lingering on the evidence box on the bed. "Detective Miller is a good man, but he's not from around here. He doesn't understand these mountains. And you do. I know enough to respect them," Cobb said. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the folksy mask dropped. She saw something hard and cold there, a warning. "Some things on that mountain are best left buried, ma'am. You found your boys. You should take them home and let it be. Let them rest in peace." He tipped his head, a gesture that was meant to be polite, but felt like a dismissal. He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the motel's concrete walkway. Sarah closed the door, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a sudden, clarifying rage. Let be. It wasn't advice. It was a threat. He knew what had happened. He had known for 10 years. And the symbol in her son's book was the key. It was the last thing Eli ever saw, the last message he ever sent. She wouldn't let it be buried again. Her decade of searching was over. Her hunt had just begun. The morning sun did little to burn off the chill that clung to Havenwood Gap. It was a town steeped in secrets, its silence as thick and suffocating as the morning fog that settled in the valley. Sarah started her investigation at the heart of the community, the diner. It was a small, cramped place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee and fried bacon. When she walked in, the low hum of conversation faltered, then died completely. Every eye turned to her, and she felt the weight of their collective gaze, curious, wary, and deeply unwelcoming. She was the outsider, the black woman from the city, the grieving wife whose tragedy had brought state police and unwanted attention to their quiet corner of the world. She took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking. The waitress, a woman with a tired face and a name tag that read Brenda, served her without a word, her movements stiff and economical. I was hoping to ask a few questions, Sarah began, her voice calm and even, about what happened 10 years ago, when my husband and son went missing. Brenda wiped down a clean section of the counter, her back to Sarah. That was a long time ago. Someone must remember something, Sarah pressed. They were strangers here, a father and his son. They would have stood out. A man sitting a few booths away, burly and bearded, spoke without looking at her. Folks mind their own business around here. The murmur of agreement that followed was quiet but unanimous. Sarah pulled a photograph from her purse, a picture of Samuel and Eli taken just before the trip. Samuel had his arm around Eli's shoulders, both of them beaming, the autumn sun lighting up their faces. She placed it on the counter. This is them, Samuel and Elijah. Did you see them? Did they stop in here for a meal? Buy gas? Ask for directions? Brenda glanced at the photo, her expression unreadable, then quickly looked away. Can't say I did. It was the same everywhere she went. At the town's only gas station, the attendant claimed his memory was shot. At the general store, the owner looked right through her, his eyes as vacant as the dusty shelves behind him. It was a town without a memory, a community that had collectively agreed to forget. They weren't just being unhelpful. They were actively obstructing her, building a wall of silence brick by brick. They were protecting something, or someone. Frustrated and angry, Sarah realized she was looking in the wrong place. The town's living memory was a dead end. But its paper memory, that was her territory. She drove the 40 minutes to the county seat and walked into the courthouse, a place that felt more familiar and comforting to her now than any church or community hall. The air inside was cool and smelled of floor wax and old paper, the scent of her own world. She was no longer a grieving widow asking for favors. She was an archivist, a professional, and she knew exactly how to make the past speak. She started in the records office, introducing herself to the county clerk as a researcher looking into historical land ownership patterns. For the next 5 hours, she worked with a methodical, all-consuming focus. She pulled plat maps, property deeds, and survey records for Black Ridge Mountain dating back to the 1950s. The land where the cave was located, the land where Samuel and Eli had parked their truck, wasn't state or federal park land, as she had always assumed. According to the maps from 1995, the entire eastern face of the ridge, a parcel of over 2,000 acres, belonged to a single entity, the Hawthorne Timber Company. The name meant nothing to her, but it was a thread. She cross-referenced the company's corporate filings. The Hawthorne Timber Company had been founded in 1958 by a man named Silas Hawthorne. They'd run a logging operation on the mountain for 2 decades. Then, in 1979, the record showed they had abruptly ceased all operations. The company hadn't been dissolved. It had just gone dormant, though it continued to pay property taxes on the land every year. It made no sense. Why would a company stop a profitable business but continue to hold onto a massive, non-productive piece of land for 26 years. She dug deeper, pulling tax records and old newspaper articles on microfilm. Silas Hawthorne had been a local magnate, a man who had built his empire with a reputation for ruthlessness. He had died in the early 90s, leaving the company and the land to his two sons, Caleb and Brody Hawthorne. They still lived in Havenwood Gap, their names appearing occasionally in the local paper for minor public donations or sponsoring the high school football team. They were pillars of the community, a community that suddenly couldn't remember seeing a black man and his son a decade ago. As the courthouse prepared to close, Sarah packed her notes, her mind racing. The Hawthornes owned the land. They had a history there. Their business had stopped suddenly. It was a pattern, but one she couldn't yet decipher. She walked out into the late afternoon sun, feeling the first real glimmer of progress since she'd arrived. And then she saw her car. A long, deep scratch ran the entire length of the driver's side, from the headlight to the taillight. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, angry gouge dug deep into the metal with a key or a nail. Her heart went cold. She walked slowly around the car, her eyes scanning for anything else. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a small piece of folded paper. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The message was written in crude block letters, pressed hard into the paper. Last warning. The threat was stark, unambiguous. Someone had watched her go into the courthouse. Someone had waited for her to come out. Someone knew she was getting close. She looked around the quiet street, at the cars passing by, at the people walking on the sidewalk. Any one of them could be watching her right now. The silence of the town wasn't just protective. It was menacing. She was no longer just an outsider asking questions. She was a target. She got into her car, the ugly scar on its side, a visceral reminder of the violence that lay coiled just beneath the town's placid surface. The warning was meant to scare her away. But as she started the engine and pulled out onto the street, all she felt was a hardening of her resolve. They had given her a name, Hawthorne, and now they had confirmed she was on the right path. The threat didn't send Sarah running. It focused her. The crude warning on her windshield was a confirmation, a flare sent up by a hidden enemy acknowledging they had seen her, that they considered her a danger. The name Hawthorne was no longer just a notation in a dusty ledger. It was the center of everything. She knew she couldn't confront them directly. In a town this insular, a direct accusation would be met with denial and, likely, more violence. She needed leverage. She needed a crack in the wall of silence, and she suspected the crack's name was Earl Pritchard. Finding him wasn't hard. In a town the size of Havenwood Gap, a disgraced former deputy was a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered about over beers at the town's single bar. Earl had been fired by Sheriff Cobb back in '98, the official reason being drunkenness on duty. But the courthouse gossip Sarah had overheard suggested it was more complicated. He'd crossed the wrong people, one clerk had muttered. Sarah was willing to bet the wrong people were the Hawthornes. She found him living in a dilapidated trailer at the edge of town, a rusted pickup truck in the yard, and a half-dozen empty beer cans glinting in the overgrown grass. He was a shadow of the man she saw in old newspaper clippings. Thinner, grayer, with the haunted, restless eyes of someone who spends too much time looking over his shoulder. When he saw her standing at his gate, his face went pale with a fear so profound it was almost pitiable. "I've got nothing to say to you," he said, his voice raspy, before she could even speak. He started to close the door. "They're threatening me, Earl," Sarah said, her voice low but carrying. "Just like they threatened you." He froze, his hand on the doorknob. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The Hawthornes," she said, pressing her advantage. "I know they own the land. I know you were a deputy when my husband and son were murdered. And I know Sheriff Cobb didn't fire you for being drunk. He fired you because you saw something you weren't supposed to see." He stared at her, his fear warring with a flicker of something else. Anger, resentment, the ghost of a conscience. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, with a defeated sigh, he opened the door wider. "Get in, and don't let anyone see you." The inside of the trailer smelled of stale cigarette, smoke, and regret. Earl sat at his small kitchen table, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. "You're going to get yourself killed," he said, not looking at her. "Tell me what you know, and maybe I won't," Sarah countered. And so, the story came tumbling out, a torrent of confession and fear that had been dammed up for years. "The Hawthorns don't run a timber company," Earl began, his voice barely a whisper. "They never really did. That was just a front. The real money, the money that built this town and owns everyone in it, comes from the mountain itself." "Mining?" Sarah asked. Earl let out a short, bitter laugh. "Not the kind you get a permit for." Silas Hawthorne, the old man, he found a rich vein of something valuable up there back in the 50s. Rare earth minerals, stuff the government pays a fortune for, no questions asked. He mined it illegally for decades, using local boys who knew how to keep their mouths shut. Paid them in cash, kept the whole operation off the books. That's the town's secret. The Hawthorne mine. He took a long drag from his cigarette. "Your husband, he was a photographer. A good one. He wasn't just taking pictures of leaves. He was documenting everything. He must have stumbled on the old mine entrance. It was well hidden, but he was the kind of man who noticed things." Sarah felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She pulled the folded sketch of the three-pronged symbol from her pocket and slid it across the table. "My son drew this." It was the last thing in his journal. Earl stared at the drawing, and a fresh wave of fear washed over his face. He recoiled as if the paper were hot. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. "That's the old Hawthorne brand. Silas used to burn it into trees to mark his claim. It's on the rock face right above the mine entrance. Your boy saw it. He saw their mark." Now she understood. Samuel and Eli hadn't just been in the wrong place. They had found the one secret the entire town was built on. They had become a threat to the Hawthorne legacy. "Cobb knew," Sarah stated, her voice hard as flint. "He was on their payroll." "Everyone was on their payroll," Earl said miserably. "Me too for a while. A few $100 a month to look the other way. But I never knew. I never thought they'd kill a child." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "After it happened, Cobb told me to forget what I saw, forget the missing persons report. But I couldn't. I started asking questions. That's when Caleb Hawthorne paid me a visit. Told me if I didn't shut my mouth, my family would be attending my funeral. Cobb fired me the next day to make it look official. It was a message to the whole town." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There's an old mining office, a shack deep in the woods off Route 613. They used to run the whole operation from there. If there's any proof, any written records, it would be there. But Sarah, they'll kill you if they catch you." "Give me the location," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. He drew a crude map on a napkin, his hand shaking so badly the lines were jagged. As she took it, he grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "For what it's worth, I am sorry about your boy." Sarah pulled her arm away and left without another word. Pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. She drove her rental car, the one with the angry scar down its side, up the winding mountain road of Route 613. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. The woods grew thick and dark on either side. She found the turnoff Earl had described, a barely visible dirt track almost completely reclaimed by nature. As she slowed to make the turn, she saw a flicker of movement in her rearview mirror. A large, dark pickup truck, a Ford F-250, caked in mud, was cresting the hill behind her, moving fast. Her heart leaped in her throat. It had no headlights on, a black shape closing the distance with terrifying speed. She slammed her foot on the accelerator, abandoning the turn and speeding up the mountain road. The truck roared up behind her, its massive grille filling her entire mirror. Then came a first impact, a jarring, metallic crash that sent her car lurching forward. He was ramming her. She fought the wheel, trying to keep the car on the narrow road. To her right was a sheer rock face. To her left, a steep, wooded ravine and a drop of several hundred feet. The truck hit her again, harder this time, the sound of buckling metal screaming in her ears. He was trying to push her over the edge. She saw the driver in her mirror now, a silhouette, a man in a baseball cap. He was trying to kill her. The chase was a blur of terror, of screeching tires and the sickening crunch of metal. He hit her a third time, and her rear tire blew out. The car swerved violently toward the ravine. This was it. She was going to die on the same mountain that had taken her family. Panic was a white-hot fire in Sarah's veins, but 10 years of cold, disciplined grief had forged something stronger underneath it, a will of iron. As the car fishtailed wildly, its blown tire screaming against the asphalt, she wrenched the steering wheel to the right, away from the ravine's edge. The car slammed into the rocky mountainside with a gut-wrenching groan of tortured metal, sparks flying as it scraped along the rock face before shuddering to a halt. The air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber and her own ragged breath. In the rearview mirror, she saw the Dar pickup screech to a stop about 50 yards back. A door opened. He was coming for her. She didn't hesitate. She threw her door open and scrambled out, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulder from the impact. The mining office. It was her only chance. She plunged into the dense woods on the opposite side of the road. The overgrown path Earl had marked on his napkin, now her only hope for survival. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her clothes, but she didn't slow down. Behind her, she could hear the heavy, crashing footsteps of her pursuer. He was bigger, stronger, but she had a head start and the desperate agility of prey. The path was barely visible, a ghost of a road from a forgotten time. She ran for what felt like an eternity, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. Finally, through the trees, she saw it, a small, dilapidated shack, its roof sagging, its windows boarded up, slowly being swallowed by the forest. The old mining office. She threw her weight against the door. It was locked. She heard the footsteps getting closer, the sound of snapping twigs echoing in the twilight. Panic seized her again. She scanned the shack's exterior and saw a small, grimy window near the back, its glass long gone, the opening covered by a single rotting plank. She ripped it away, the wood crumbling in her hands, and hauled herself through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the dusty floor inside. The air in the shack was stale and thick with the smell of decay and damp earth. Moonlight filtered through the grimy windows, illuminating a scene of abandonment. A single desk and chair sat in the middle of the room, covered in a thick blanket of dust. Overturned cabinets and scattered, moldy papers littered the floor. It looked like it had been cleared out in a hurry a long time ago. Had she come all this way for nothing? She heard him outside, circling the shack, his footsteps slow and deliberate now. He was hunting her. She had to find it. She had to find the proof. She dropped to her knees, her hands frantically sweeping through the debris on the floor, her mind racing. Where would you hide something you never wanted found? Not in a cabinet. Not in a desk. She crawled over to the desk and looked underneath. Nothing. Her eyes darted around the small room, and she noticed a section of the floorboards near the far wall. They looked different, the wood slightly warped, the nails newer than the others. With trembling fingers, she pried at the edge of a board. It was loose. She pulled it up, then another. Beneath them, nestled in the dark, damp earth, was a metal lockbox, rusted but intact. Her heart surged with a fierce, triumphant hope. She lifted it out. It was heavy. As she fumbled with the rusted latch, her phone, which she'd thought was broken in the crash, suddenly buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The screen was cracked, but it was working. The caller ID read, ERL. She answered, her voice a choked whisper. Hello. Sarah? Oh God. Sarah, they know you're there. Earl's voice was a panicked squeak, tight with terror. Cop called me. He said Caleb was on his way to the office to clean up a loose end. I tried to warn you. I swear. I never meant for this to happen. He's going to kill me. Caleb. Sarah breathed, the name hanging in the dusty air. Caleb Hawthorne. He's the one. Earl sobbed. He runs everything now. He's just like his father, only meaner. Get out of there, Sarah. The line went dead. She didn't need the warning. She could hear the heavy tread on the porch steps, the creak of the front door as it was forced open. She scrambled back into the darkest corner of the room, behind the overturned filing cabinet, clutching the lockbox to her chest. Caleb Hawthorne stepped into the shack. He was a large, imposing man, his features hard and unforgiving in the gloom. He held a heavy-duty flashlight in one hand and a hunting rifle in the other. He swept the beam of light across the room, methodically, patiently. He knew she was in here. It was just a matter of time. Sarah held her breath, her body rigid. The beam passed over her hiding spot, lingered, then moved on. He walked to the center of the room, his boots crunching on the debris. He saw the disturbed floorboards, the empty space where the lockbox had been. A low, guttural sound of fury escaped his lips. "I know you're here," he called out, his voice a low, menacing drawl that echoed the cold certainty of Sheriff Cobb. "You've been a real pain in my ass, you know that? Digging up things that ought to stay buried." He took a step closer to her corner. "My daddy taught me you don't leave loose ends. Your husband didn't understand that. He thought his camera and his city morals gave him a right to stick his nose where it didn't belong. A fatal mistake." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of terror and fury. This was him, the man who had murdered her husband, the man who had sealed her 12-year-old son in a dark hole to die. She fumbled with the latch on the box, her fingers clumsy with adrenaline. It sprang open. Inside, protected from the damp by oilcloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. The pages were filled with neat, spidery handwriting detailing dates, weights, and payments going back years. It was the entire history of the illegal mining operation. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning for one date. October 1995. She found it. The entry for that month was different. It didn't list tons of or dollar amounts for payroll. It was a short, chilling list of expenses. New blasting caps, 12 sticks dynamite, mortar mix, and below that a final, damning line, trespasser problem solved. 2 heads, full cost. Her breath hitched in a sob she couldn't suppress. 2 heads. That's what they were to him. A problem to be solved. Beneath the ledger was a photograph, a Polaroid, faded with age. It showed a younger, grinning Caleb Hawthorne standing next to Sheriff Cobb. They were holding rifles, posing proudly over a dead 10-point buck. The proof, the conspiracy, the murders, it was all here in her hands. The sound of her gasp gave her away. The flashlight beam snapped back, pinning her in its blinding glare. Caleb smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "There you are." He raised his rifle. "Should have taken the sheriff's advice. Now you get to join your family." Trapped in the blinding beam of Caleb Hawthorne's flashlight, Sarah's world narrowed to the dark bore of the rifle barrel pointed at her chest. Death was here, in this rotting shack, wearing the face of this remorseless man. But the terror that had threatened to paralyze her moments before now receded, replaced by a wave of pure, cold fury. She was not going to die cowering in a corner. Not after 10 years. Not when she held the truth in her hands. "It's all in here, Caleb," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She held up the ledger, her knuckles white. Every payment, every name. Sheriff Cobb, Earl Pritchard, all of them. And the entry for October 1995. "Trespasser problem solved," you wrote it all down. Caleb's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicking to the book. He had thought this evidence was long gone, buried with the shack itself. "That book doesn't leave this room," he snarled, taking a step forward. "Maybe not," Sarah said, her mind racing, searching for an escape, an advantage, any sliver of hope. "But they know I'm here. They know I was coming to find this. It was a bluff, but a desperate one." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Who knows? That drunken fool, Earl? He's probably dead already. Cobb? He's at home watching television, secure in the knowledge that I'm cleaning up his mess. There's no one coming for you, Sarah." He was right. She was alone, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She thought of Samuel's quiet strength, of Eli's bright, curious eyes. She owed them more than that. In a single, fluid motion, she lunged not away from him, but sideways, toward the shack's gaping, windowless opening. She threw the heavy ledger out into the darkness, hearing it thud into the thick undergrowth, then scrambled after it, diving headfirst through the opening just as the rifle roared behind her. The shot splintered the wood where her head had been a second before. She landed hard on the damp earth, the impact knocking the wind out of her, but she didn't stop. She crawled frantically into the bushes, searching for the ledger. Her hand closed around its leather cover. She had it. Behind her, she heard Caleb curse, then the sound of him crashing through the front door in pursuit. She couldn't outrun him in the open. He was bigger, and he knew this terrain. But she had something he didn't: the maps she had studied, the survey lines she had memorized. She knew this mountain now, not as a resident, but as a scholar of its secrets. And she knew there was only one place to go, a place he would have to follow, a place where it all began and where it had to end: the cave. She ran, fueled by an adrenaline-laced cocktail of terror and purpose. She didn't use a flashlight, relying on the faint moonlight that filtered through the thick canopy of trees. She was running blind, but she trusted her memory, the mental map she had built over the last few days. She could hear him behind her, a relentless, crashing presence in the woods, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. The forest was alive with the sounds of their desperate chase. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. She was climbing now, her lungs screaming for air, her legs burning with lactic acid. She recognized the landscape from the police photos, the distinct rock outcroppings, the stand of ancient hemlock trees. She was close. She finally broke through a thicket of rhododendron and saw it. The mouth of the cave. The state police had removed the seal, but had cordoned it off with yellow tape. It looked like a raw, open wound in the side of the mountain. Her family's tomb. She ducked under the tape and scrambled inside, pressing herself against the cold, damp rock wall just inside the entrance. She clutched the ledger to her chest, her heart pounding a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She waited. The woods outside went silent. Too silent. He was here. He was being cautious now, hunting. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, his silhouette blotted out the moonlight at the cave's entrance. He stepped inside, his rifle held at the ready, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. Nowhere left to run. "Sarah," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The beam swept across the small chamber, illuminating the bare rock walls, the place where her husband and son had taken their last breaths. "Why, Caleb?" she asked, her voice shaking but clear. "He was just a boy." The flashlight found her, pinning her against the wall. Caleb's face was a mask of cold indifference. "He saw my face. Your husband, he was righteous. He took photos of the mine, said he was going to the authorities. I offered him money. He spit in my face. Called it blood money. So I showed him what blood really was. He took a step closer. The boy, he was a loose end. Can't have loose ends." The casual cruelty of his words stole her breath. He described the murder of her child as if he were discussing a business transaction. In that moment, she knew she was going to die. But as she looked into his dead eyes, she felt a strange sense of calm. She had the truth. She had brought it all the way here to their final resting place. "You won't get away with this," she whispered. "This ledger, it'll be found. And who's going to find it?" He sneered, raising his rifle to his shoulder, taking aim. "No one even knows you're up here." He was wrong. A single, deafening shot cracked through the night, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the mountain. It didn't come from Caleb's rifle. A red flower bloomed on his chest, and a look of pure, animal shock crossed his face. He staggered backward, his rifle clattering to the cave floor. He looked down at his wound, then up at Sarah, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He collapsed in a heap, not 10 feet from where her family's bodies had lain for a decade. Sarah stared, her mind unable to process what had just happened. Then, a figure stepped into the cave mouth, silhouetted against the moonlit sky, a pistol held firmly in a two-handed grip. It was Detective Miller. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice calm and steady as he advanced into the cave, kicking Caleb's rifle away. Sarah could only nod, her legs giving way as she slid down the rock wall to the floor, the heavy ledger falling into her lap. "How?" she managed to stammer. I had a feeling the locals weren't telling me the whole truth, Miller said, checking Caleb's pulse and shaking his head. Especially after your car was vandalized. I placed a GPS tracker on your rental this morning. Figured if you went looking for trouble, you'd find it. I've been about a quarter mile behind you this whole time. When I heard the first shot back at the shack, I called for backup. They should be here any minute. He looked from the body of Caleb Hawthorne to the ledger in Sarah's lap, then back to her face, streaked with dirt and tears. Looks like you found it, Mrs. Jones. You found the truth. She looked down at the book, its pages filled with the secrets and sins of this mountain, and then at the dark, still form of the man who had haunted her dreams for 10 years. It was over. The hunt was finally over. The aftermath was as swift and overwhelming as a flash flood. Within the hour, the quiet woods of Black Ridge Mountain were swarming with the flashing blue and red lights of Virginia State Police cruisers. The wail of sirens, a sound of order and authority, echoed through the valley that had for so long been ruled by a conspiracy of silence. Detective Miller's call for backup had unleashed the full force of the state's investigative power on the unsuspecting town of Havenwood Gap. Sarah sat wrapped in a coarse wool blanket on the tailgate of an ambulance, the heavy ledger resting beside her like a sacred text. She watched as crime scene technicians worked under harsh floodlights, their movements precise and methodical as they processed the scene at the cave, her family's tomb, now the final resting place of their killer. Caleb Hawthorne's body was zipped into a black bag and carried away, an ignominious end for a man who had considered himself a king. With the ledger as an irrefutable roadmap to the town's corruption, the state police moved with ruthless efficiency. Before the sun rose, they descended on Havenwood Gap. They arrested a stunned Sheriff Cobb at his breakfast table, his face ashen as he was led away in handcuffs. They picked up Brody Hawthorne, who crumbled under questioning and implicated his dead brother in everything, desperate to save himself. And they found Earl Pritchard, not dead as he had feared, but hiding in his trailer, paralyzed by terror. He gave a full confession, detailing his role and the roles of a half-dozen other locals who had been on the Hawthorne payroll for years. The wall of silence that had stood for decades shattered in a single night. Sarah gave her statement to Miller, recounting every detail of her investigation, from the cryptic symbol in Eli's book to the final, terrifying confrontation in the cave. She handed him the ledger, the weight of it finally lifted from her hands. Your husband and son would be proud of you, Mrs. Jones, Miller said, his voice filled with a quiet, profound respect. They were victims, but you made them the authors of their own justice. The days that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and grim discoveries. Guided by the ledger's records and Brody Hawthorne's desperate confessions, investigators unearthed the full scope of the family's sins. They found the illegal mine, its entrance dynamited shut just as the ledger described. And in the woods nearby, they found what Sarah had both longed for and dreaded, a burial site. Samuel and Eli had not been left in the cave. They had been moved, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave, their bodies wrapped in canvas. Bringing them home, truly home, was now possible. The trials were swift. Faced with the ledger, the confessions, and the testimony of Sarah Jones, the conspirators had no defense. Brody Hawthorne, in exchange for his testimony, received a sentence of life in prison. Sheriff Cobb, stripped of his authority and his pride, was sentenced to 30 years for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The others received varying sentences, their betrayal of the public trust finally punished. The town of Havenwood Gap was left reeling, its dark secret laid bare for the world to see, its identity forever stained by the crimes it had concealed. 3 months later, Sarah stood in a quiet, sun-dappled cemetery in Charlotte, a world away from the shadows of Appalachia. She was not alone. Behind her stood a small gathering of friends and family, the people who had supported her through 10 years of agonizing uncertainty. Before her were 2 caskets, finally at rest beneath a sprawling oak tree. Samuel and Elijah were home. The service was simple, filled with stories of Samuel's quiet kindness and Eli's infectious curiosity. Sarah didn't speak, but she placed a single, perfect photograph on each casket. One was a self-portrait of Samuel, his eyes wise and gentle. The other was a photo she had taken of Eli, his face lit up with a joyful grin as he held up his birdwatching guide. In the year that followed, Sarah began to build a new life, one not defined by grief, but by legacy. The state seized all of the Hawthorne family's assets. The illicit fortune built on a foundation of fear and murder. As the primary victim, a significant portion of the restitution was awarded to Sarah. She used every penny to create the Jones Grant, a foundation dedicated to funding young, aspiring nature photographers from underserved communities, giving them the chance to see and capture the world's beauty, just as Samuel and Eli had. Her office, once a sterile archive of other people's histories, was now filled with the vibrant work of these young artists. But on her desk, in a simple silver frame, sat one photograph that was more precious than any other. During the investigation, Detective Miller had sent Samuel's rusted Nikon camera to a specialist at the FBI lab. Against all odds, they had managed to recover a single image from the last roll of film, the very last picture Samuel ever took. It was a slightly blurry shot, taken in low light, but its subject was clear. It was a photo of Eli, standing at the mouth of a dark cave, holding up his field guide with a look of triumphant discovery on his face. He was smiling, proud to show his father what he had found. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, but unmistakable to Sarah, was the three-pronged symbol carved into the rock. It was a photo of the precise moment their fate was sealed. For months, Sarah had found it too painful to look at. But now, she saw something else. She saw not their end, but the unbreakable bond between a father and son, sharing a moment of discovery in the wilderness they both loved. The foundation was thriving. The letters and photos from the grant recipients filled a part of her heart she thought would forever be empty. The mountain still stood, ancient and impassive, but its power to harm her was gone. It had taken her family, but it had also, in the end, given up its truth. Justice had been served, not by the system alone, but by a mother's refusal to forget. Her love, harder than stone and more relentless than time, had brought the mountain to its knees.